Question 16. Aren't the arguments made to defend the exclusion of women from the pastorate today parallel to the arguments Christians made to defend slavery in the 19th century? See question 15 for the beginning of our answer to this problem. To go a little further, the preservation of marriage is not parallel with the preservation of slavery. The existence of slavery is not rooted in any creation ordinance, but the existence of marriage is. Paul's regulations for how slaves and masters should relate to each other do not assume the goodness of the institution of slavery. Rather, seeds for slavery's dissolution were sown in Philemon verse 16. No longer as a bondservant but more than a bondservant, as a beloved brother. Ephesians chapter 6 verse 9. Masters, stop your threatening toward your bondservants. Colossians chapter 4 verse 1. Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly. And 1 Timothy chapter 6 verses 1 to 2. Masters and bondservants are brothers. Where these seeds of equality came to full flower, the very institution of slavery would cease. In fact, when 1 Timothy chapter 1 verse 10 is understood correctly, it absolutely prohibits involuntary servitude. For it lists enslavers among a list of people who are ungodly and sinners. Verse 9. But Paul's regulations for how husbands and wives relate to each other in marriage do assume the goodness of the institution of marriage. And not only its goodness but also its foundation in the will of the Creator from the beginning of time. Ephesians chapter 5 verses 31 to 32. Moreover, Paul locates the foundation of marriage in the will of God at creation, in a way that shows that his regulations for marriage also flow from this created order. He quotes Genesis chapter 2 verse 24. They shall become one flesh. And explains, I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. From this mystery, he draws out the pattern of the relationship between the husband as head, on the analogy of Christ, and the wife as his body or flesh, on the analogy of the church, and derives the appropriateness of the husband's leadership and the wife's submission. Thus Paul's regulations concerning marriage are just as rooted in the created order as is the institution itself. This is not true of slavery. Therefore, while some slave owners in the 19th century admittedly argued in ways parallel with our defense of distinct roles in marriage, the parallel was superficial and misguided. Those who attempted to defend slavery from the Bible were clearly wrong in their interpretations, and they decisively lost the argument. Mary Stuart Van Leeuwen points out from 1 Timothy chapter 6 verses 1 to 6. That according to the 19th century Christian supporters of slavery, even though the institution of slavery did not go back to creation, the fact that Paul based its maintenance on a revelation from Jesus himself meant that anyone wishing to abolish slavery, or even improve the slaves' working conditions, was defying timeless biblical norms for society. The problem with this argument is that Paul uses the teachings of Jesus not to maintain the institution of slavery, but to regulate the behavior of Christian slaves and masters in an institution that already existed in part because of sin. What Jesus endorses is the kind of inner freedom and love that is willing to go the extra mile in service, even when the demand is unjust. Matthew chapter 5 verse 41. Therefore, it is wrong to say that the words of Jesus give a foundation for slavery in the same way that creation gives a foundation for marriage. Jesus does not give any foundation for slavery, but creation gives an unshakable foundation for marriage and for the complementary roles of husband and wife. Finally, if those who ask this question are concerned to avoid the mistakes of Christians who defended slavery, we must remember the real possibility that it is not complementarians but evangelical feminists, who today resemble 19th century defenders of slavery in the most significant way, using arguments from the Bible to justify conformity to some very strong pressures in contemporary society, in favor of slavery then and feminism now.